If you're listening to this podcast, it's probably because a child you love and care for is differently wired. Are they also struggling in their current educational setting, seen only for what they're doing wrong while longing for positive relationships with peers and others? Envision a world where your child's unique abilities are not just recognized, but celebrated. A world where they can connect with others and their true potential is seen and appreciated. The Strength-Based Assessment Lab's mission is to build a world for your child just like that. Through its innovative approach, it aims to empower students, families, educators, and professionals to create positive, effective, and collaborative learning experiences. Be a part of shaping a brighter future for your child. Visit www.bgs.edu to learn more about what a strength-based assessment could mean for your family. That's bgs.edu.
Most parents don't know what I'm about to talk to you about. This is an area of confusion and darkness and shame and embarrassment. And most parents, most of us had really crappy examples when we were growing up.
Welcome to the Tilt Parenting Podcast, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber, and today's guest is Amy Lang, a sexuality educator and parenting expert. So, before I go any further, I want to let you know that today Amy and I are going to be having a very frank and very open conversation about sex ed for kids, which means we'll be referring to body parts by their proper names and also talking about things you might not want your little ones to hear at this particular time. So, if you've got kids in the room or in the car with you, I'll give you a moment to pause the podcast before continuing. Okay, ready? As I was saying, today Amy and I are going to get into it all when it comes to sex ed and our differently wired kids, what they need to know, when they need to know it, how to talk about it, and most importantly, why Amy feels so passionately that sex ed is a health and safety issue for our children, and I completely agree. And before we get into our conversation, I wanted to take a quick moment to give a shout out to Ashley Dolan. Ashley's a new backer of the Tilt Parenting Podcast through our Patreon campaign. Thank you so much for your support of what we're doing. And if you'd like to join Ashley through Patreon, you can make a small monthly contribution that will go towards funding the production costs associated with our podcasts. Even $2 a month makes a big difference. If you'd like to support what we're doing here at the podcast, please check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/tiltparenting. Thanks for considering and for being a part of our community. And now let's get on with the show. Hey everyone, it's Debbie Reber here with the Tilt Parenting Podcast, and I'm happy to be welcoming a very smart friend of mine to the show today, the fabulous Amy Lang. Welcome to the show, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you. It's been a while.
It's been a while. I'm very excited to have you on the show. And as I said in the introduction to this episode, you are a sexuality educator. And on your website, you write that you are fiercely committed to guiding parents and other adults to become empowered to have regular, open, and effective conversations about the birds and the bees with the kids they love. You also write that my goal is to help you raise up your children into healthy, happy, and whole adults who understand and embrace their unique sexuality. So first of all, I love that. I loved reading that. And I'm just excited to be sharing you with the Tilt Parenting audience today. I've definitely gotten questions from time to time from listeners about having the sex talk with their differently wired kids. And I also know that we could probably talk about this for hours. You have a ton of great information to share. So I think we should just dive in. Does that sound like a plan? Excellent. I would love if we could start, if you could just take a few minutes to tell us about who you are as a parent and a sex educator, kind of, a bit about your story and how exactly you came to be doing this work, which I know is your passion.
Where do I start? I have been involved in sex education since I was 20-ish, 21, 22, and I volunteered for a telephone hotline, and I was providing abortion and birth control and adoption and pregnancy counseling over the phone to women who were dealing with unplanned pregnancy. And I loved it. And that led me to running the hotline and just doing general sexual health education and counseling for over 16 years. And it was my hobby. And I was in my element working with people around this really uncomfortable topic. And I would even like rearrange my work schedule to accommodate my volunteer schedule. So this was definitely a big part of my world. And I had assumed that when I became a parent, I was just going to be a total rock star sex talker. I love talking about sexuality. I'd talk to pretty much anybody you can think of about their sex life in one way or the other. And I also, along the way, got a master's degree in adult education. And so I ended up getting pregnant the year I got my degree, and my pregnancy was planned because, that was not going to happen to me. And then when my son was about 4, he was getting ready for a bath, and I thought he was going to tell me it felt good to touch his penis. And I just freaked out like in my head. And I'm like, oh no, you better not tell me it feels good to touch your penis, because I got nothing. I don't know what to say to you. I don't know how to explain to you what's going on. Please don't talk to me about your penis. So I had this whole internal, ridiculous, in retrospect, dialogue. And that was the moment where I thought, oh crap, I am not ready to have a conversation with a kid about sex. And it wasn't even about sex. It was just about his bod. So that led me to doing some research. And then I realized that I was probably not the only parent on the planet that was going to, potentially suck at these conversations. So I decided to start a company, and my company is called Birds and Bees and Kids. And my whole goal was to help parents figure out how to have values-based, research-based, effective, fun conversations with their kiddos. And, I don't work with children at all. I just work with my one lovely now 16-year-old human being who is completely mortified by my work. So super fun over here. And so Milo's 16, and my husband Carrie and I have been married for a long time. I can never remember. I think it's 23 years or maybe 25. I don't know. It requires me doing math. So we have regular conversations with him. He is the worst audience ever. He does not want to hear it. So it's made me super skilled at like being the super sneaky sex talker. Anyway, so that's my story. And so I've been doing this for since 2005. And that's what I was put on the planet to do.
Wow. That's great. I love that. I love how your personal journey ties in and kind of was the impetus for you becoming who you are. I find that that's certainly the case with my journey as well. Asher is so responsible for who I am and what I do today. And I just think it's one of the many gifts that our kids give us.
Definitely.
And just for listeners, you are from Seattle, which is where I used to live with Asher and my husband before we moved to the Netherlands. And long before you and I ever met, I think we must have known each other at this point now for 8 or so years. But even before I met you, I heard about you because you were the birds and the bees lady. Like you were the go-to person in the Seattle region. And I know that your reputation, virtually expands internationally, but I just knew I'm like, oh, you want to have the talk? You want to figure this out? You have to talk to Amy. Like, ever come talk to your group. So, and I remember at the time, I think I was in a parent group and we were kind of discussing when do we have these conversations? And personally, we've always gone with the honesty policy that honest questions get honest answers. And I think Asher asked some pretty caught me off guard, questions about sexuality or where babies came from. And I remember just my default was to be pretty matter of fact, scientific, honest about it. But what is your advice with regards to when to begin these conversations with kids? Is it child focused or should we be initiating these conversations?
So that is one of the biggest questions parents have. And the biggest myth out there about sex talking is that it is child-centered. It is not their job to ask us questions about sex and sexuality and their bodies. Think about it in terms of like their nutrition. Like it's not your kid's job to tell you what's for dinner. Right? It's not your kid's job to do the grocery shopping. It's not your kid's job to be in charge of making sure they eat a balanced diet. That is totally your responsibility. The sexuality conversations, same thing. It's not your child's job to ask you how babies are made. It's your job to tell your child, this is how babies are made. This is what sex is. These are our, family values about sexuality. It's your responsibility to make sure that they are healthy and they understand how things work. Same with their nutrition, right? Like, Your job is to make sure your child understands why it's important to eat fruits and vegetables, right? That's not their job. And they don't ask questions usually about their diet, right? They kind of do, like, why can't I have mac and cheese for every meal, right? They get those kinds of questions, and then we respond. So, and when it comes to sexuality, of course your kids are going to ask questions or not. Lots of kids never ask. Your child's going to have some questions. So when you're waiting for them to ask you questions about how babies are made or about sexuality in general, you're making their sexual health their responsibility. It is not their responsibility. It's our responsibility. So if you've been waiting for your kid to ask you about how babies are made or whatever, you're not doing them any favors, because it's not their job. It's your job.
That's a great reframe. Okay, so if it's our job, when do we start then having these conversations?
So that's the good news and the bad news. So I also just want to back up the truck a minute and say a couple of things. So first of all, most parents don't know what I'm about to talk to you about. Like, this is an area of confusion and darkness and shame and embarrassment. And most of us had really crappy examples of how to parent around sexuality when we were growing up. So as I'm talking, if you're doing the old guilt and shame thing, don't bother. You don't know what you don't know. And in particular, with differently wired kids, they're actually more vulnerable. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So the snarky short answer to the question is at birth. The kinder, more like, we can get this party started anytime answer is this. I know you're in the Netherlands, right? And
yes.
So one of the things that I did when I started my company was like, all right, I got to figure out who's got it all going on. Like, who has the lowest teen pregnancy rate? Who has the lowest, teen STD and HIV rate? And that is where you are in the Netherlands. They have in the world. They completely rock it when it comes to childhood sexual health and adolescent sexual health. So I'm like, all right, what's happening there that is not happening in the United States? In the US, we're still number one in the developed world in terms of teen pregnancy and teen sexually transmitted infection rates. So we suck at this. And so looking at the Netherlands and their model is very early sex education, oftentimes starting in kindergarten. Yep. And when I say sex education, I mean like penis goes in vagina. Like, they are straight up with kids from a really early age. And then that education continues all the way through their schooling. So they have they've clearly embraced the fact that sexuality is a natural part of life and that children deserve to be educated about it. So that's like the first thing that's going on there. The second thing that's going on there is that they have this really open culture around sexuality. They get that it's a natural, healthy part of life. It's a wonderful part of life. They are progressive in terms of their philosophy about sexuality. And they really see sexuality as a positive part of life. So that's what's called, when we hear this phrase like sex positive, that's what sex positive is. It doesn't mean, I think sometimes people get hung up in the idea of sex positive, and that means, does that mean I have to wear a mask and have sex with 4 people at once? Like, no, that's not what sex positive is. Sex positive means that sex is a natural, healthy, fun, wonderful part of life that comes with great responsibility. So my philosophy is basically the same philosophy as the Netherlands. We need to start the party. We need to start the conversations. By the time kids are 5, that's the ideal time. They're super open to it. They don't have any embarrassment or shame about the topic or their bodies. They haven't learned that yet. Some natural modesty does kick in around 9 or so. So that's typical, but, around this topic. So, when we start sooner, it's easier. It's easier on them. It's easier on us. A 5-year-old's not going to assess your behavior in the same way that a 12-year-old is. 12-year-olds are on to all of our tells, right? Like sweaty upper lip, 2 glasses of wine to get through a book. Your kid's going to notice.
Yeah.
5-year-old's going to be like, and then back on topic.
That's so great. And I'm glad you brought up the Netherlands. I mean, obviously, as an American living here, it's something, we moved here when Asher was 9. I wasn't aware of, I knew it was kind of an open culture in many ways, but I wasn't aware of the sex education piece until I took Asher to NEMO, which is our science museum. In many ways, it's your typical immersive city science museum, super interactive. There's a lot to explore. But the way it's laid out, every floor appeals to different age groups. And the higher you go up, it's an older group. And I remember Asher wanted to go to the top floor, which is the teen floor. And it is all about sex. It has an interactive, like you can play with giant tongues to French kiss. It has many different different forms of,
awesome.
of contraception. It has mannequins in various sexual positions. I mean, he did not spend really, I mean, he saw it, turned around, it was out of there. But, I'm homeschooling Asher, but I know for friends who have Americans or other expats who have their kids in Dutch schools here, that it starts at 4 and 5, talking about just the differences between boys and girls. And they very much talk about respect and attraction and same-sex attractions and dating. It goes very deep. And it is something that I think, especially, again, Americans, maybe it's our generation of parents and the way we were raised, but it's definitely so different than the messages, if we heard any messages at all, the messages that we heard as when we were kids. So you must be so busy. I imagine in your work, a lot of it is helping parents kind of deal with their own hangups before they can have the conversation. So what does that look like?
Yeah. So that looks like a couple of different things. Like you hit on one of the main things is like we really need to spend some time like thinking and talking with friends or our partners or we're parenting with about how we learned about sex when we were growing up. So what that means is where did we get our information? So who was providing the information? So how do we learn those sort of nuts and bolts stuff? And then what kinds of values messages were we taught about sexuality within our families, within the religion we were involved in, if any, culturally, ethnically, like all those different layers. Like what were the messages we got about sexuality? What were the values we got? And where did we get our information? And I believe that when we spend time looking at that it actually helps us to do a couple things. First of all, it helps us let go of what didn't work for us. It helps us embrace what did. And the biggest thing I think it does for most parents is it makes them go, okay, I do not want that for my kid. Like I want my kid to step into the world of dating and relationships feeling pretty damn confident, about how things work and about, understanding what consent means and how that looks, understanding the changes of their bodies, understanding, some of your values about dating and waiting for sex and that sort of thing. And so that they enter that arena as prepared as they can be, bearing in mind, of course, that there is nothing like, getting busy to really learn, right? I mean, it really is it's a practical application, right? You need to practice, dating, relating, all of that, like you're learning as you're going. But if you already are starting out your dating life, knowing that consent means everyone agrees, right? Knowing your personal limits, like in terms of like, okay, so I'm going to go out on this date with this person. And, how far am I willing to go? Understanding like, having personal rules, like, I don't do any physical contact for the first 3 dates. I really want to get to know the person, having family rules. Like I know one family that their rule was that the person their daughter was dating had to come to their house, engage with them on three different times. So come over for dinner, do a family event, something like that. So the parents could smell them out. Mm-hmm. And it also showed the family if the child was responsible, right? Like, yeah, I'll come over to your house for dinner, or if they were generally engaged and interested in their daughter.
Right.
Right. So if you've got a kiddo that can't work that out, like you can't come over to my house, what's the deal? Right. Like that's suspect. Right. So we also can put some guardrails in to help our kids be savvy daters. And, and I have a book called Dating Smarts that's for teenagers. It's about, actually it's for teenagers. And I've had several adults read it who are like, thank you. This is helpful. So like about how to be a savvy dater and relater so that when you're ready to do the deed, you're feeling good about it. Like I want every person the first time they have sex to say to themselves, that was 95% kick ass, right? Or, I'd even go for 85%. But like, I want them to walk away thinking, I made a good decision. This person was the right person for me to start my sexual life with. I really feel good about this, so that launches them into the rest of their relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. We'll be right back after this quick break. Darren and I are prepping for a big move at the moment, so we are fully leaning into any and everything that simplifies things, and that absolutely includes meal times. At a time when my executive functioning skills are being pushed to the limit, even planning and executing dinner for our family these days can feel like a really big lift. That's why I'm especially grateful for Green Chef, a meal service that offers pre-measured and prepped ingredients to my door. Each box is packed with foods you can feel good about, like whole fruits and vegetables, plus lean protein and whole grain options. In fact, one of the things I love most about Green Chef is that they offer options that prioritize gut and brain health, with science-backed recipes that feature ingredients like fiber, antioxidants, and omega-3 fatty acids. During this time of lots of stress, it feels really grounding to know we're supporting ourselves nutritionally. I will take all the support I can get. And Green Chef doesn't just cover dinner recipes. I can add high-quality breakfasts, lunches, and snacks to my weekly box from Green Market. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. Green Chef, the #1 meal kit for eating well. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Symbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Symbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon. And that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Symbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Symbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Symbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. I would love to just for a minute step back to what you were saying in this parent education piece. I love that you want to have parents think about what worked, what didn't work, and then what they want for their kids. What is that process like? Because I imagine a lot of this is really deep-rooted stuff that it's hard to kind of unpack.
Yeah, so that process can look like just having some casual conversations around what do you remember when you were growing up. Sometimes just the unpacking of that, just that one conversation is enough to kind of shake some of the crap loose. I think that for people who were sexually abused or experienced some kind of sexual assault or sexual trauma, it is imperative that you get therapy and that you work through those issues because it will impact your parenting around sexuality. It'll either make you hypervigilant. It can just some of the things that I know that can happen. Hypervigilance, which is not good for anyone. Complete denial that the child themselves is becoming a sexual person, which is not a good way to parent. So, I mean, there's so much, especially for women. I believe the stat is that 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted in some way. And so for most women, like we carry this burden, usually of guilt and shame. And, 99% of the time, it has nothing to do with us per se. It's about the perpetrator. So letting go some of that. And, honestly, who you are, if you need help, knowing that stat that 1 in 4 women, that's everybody. Everybody, right? And so being willing to take care of yourself, to take care of your children, I think is really hugely important. And not to dismiss men. Of course, men are sexually abused and experience sexual traumas as well. They also need to be taking care of that part of themselves. So sometimes this can be a really like a sloggy, harder feeling process. But at the end of the day, our kids need us to be healthy and whole. So if that means, hooking up with a little therapy to march through some crap so that you come out the other end being a better parent, I'm all for it. So that's one of the ways, one of the things that can happen. I think also just getting smart about what does sex education look like? Like, what are the books that are out there that are for kids? What are books for parents? just really like learning about sexuality in general. It's not rocket science. I'm not kidding. It is pretty straightforward in terms of the science, but all the social, emotional, cultural pieces, especially these days, are really getting confusing. We have all these different genders. We have all these different sexualities. We have all these different relationship styles, so there's lots more going on. So the more sex educated parents are, the more confident they feel. And then for me, I think the most important thing that parents can do for themselves and for their kids is to get really clear about their values about sexuality. And my book, Birds and Bees and Your Kids, which is available on Kindle, I help you go through this process of like, what do I believe to be true about sex and relationships? Are you a wait until marriage person? That's awesome. But marriage is not compelling to a horny in love 15-year-old. It never has been and never will be. So what is it about being married that makes that the goal, right? If you're a person like I am, I believe that people should have sex when they are socially, emotionally, physically ready, whatever that looks like. Late 20s is what I'm thinking is like ideal. I'm just kidding.
Just stunned silence here. I was like, yes, okay.
I make that joke because really, I don't want to think about my kid having sex, right? I have a 16-year-old. What we want them is to feel, like I said, like really pretty damn confident that they're ready to make that step instead of falling into it or getting it over with, right? Like many of us did. Fingers pointing back at me. Right. So I think that really there's work that needs to be done on the parent side. And the more you know, the more confident you'll feel, the more comfortable you'll feel. And I believe that, let me just tell you this. I always have so much to say. So when I started Birds and Bees and Kids, remember my kid was 4 and I had spent my life doing pregnancy and abortion counseling, STD counseling, like working with teenagers through people in their 60s. Right. And so I had seen and heard and dealt with lots of really kind of traumatic stuff in some ways and other ways not, right? And so, I come into this conversation with my 4-year-old. I'm completely at sea. I want to start a company teaching parents how to talk about sex. And so I'm sitting at my computer, I'm doing this research, and I'm worried. I'm worried that this is a really weird outlier thing. I'm worried. I'm going to tell my 5-year-old, my 4-year-old, the penis goes in the vagina. I'm worried about what people are going to think of me, judgment, shame, all that, right? I'm sitting at my computer and I have this moment and I'm like, wait a minute. Learning about sexuality and sexual health is all about health and safety. Right. This is about health. This is about my child's health. This is about my child's safety. That's my job as my kid's mama, to keep him healthy and safe. Mm-hmm. And when I had that moment for myself, I had an epiphany, right? And I thought, all right, go girl, permission granted. You can do this. I had to find the space within myself that gave me permission to talk openly with my child and to teach other parents how to do this. So I think that that's what I want parents to understand. Like, this is required. It's especially parents that have kiddos in the United States. Like, you're lucky. Well, you're homeschooling. So if you can shove them into some kind of sex ed regularly, I would do it. But in the United States, our systems are not supporting our kids in this arena. So it's up to us to be the superstar sex educators. And it's fun and it's funny. I mean, parents tell me hilarious stuff all the time about what their kids say. Anyway, sorry, off the soapbox. I just am very passionate about this, as you can tell.
I love that. And the health and safety piece, it's so clear. I mean, I'm glad you had that epiphany. And that is what this is about at its most basic level. And that is our job. So
yeah.
So what are we going for then here with these conversations? If it's about health, if it's about safety at different ages, what is the outcome that we want? And maybe another way to look at that is, what aren't we going for? What
are we going for? Right. That's actually a better way to think about it. Actually, so I think a couple things. So first of all, we really need to think about this as a process. Like, it's a continual process of conversations. So they start out with little kids. Yay, it's super fun. It's easy. You get a book. It's Not the Stork is the book I recommend for 5 and unders. And in show notes, can we do book lists and stuff?
I would love any and everything you want to recommend to us.
I really have a great resource for differently wired kids too. So
oh, perfect.
So books are key. So you get books, and with the kids that are 5 and under, it's really about body parts and safe touch and honestly what goes where, like how babies are usually made. And then as kids get older, the conversations are still about those same things, but they start to get more deep. Like, so your 8-year-old should know their body's going to grow and change from a kid body to an adult body. So you start the puberty conversations in there. And don't be afraid to be detailed because they need the details. And the other thing to remember when you're talking with your younger kids is that they're only going to get so much. So you may have to have like multiple conversations about the same thing. One time, Milo, I was at a party with Milo, and he was about 5 or so, and I was talking to a woman, and she's like, well, what do you do? And I'm like, I help parents talk to their kids about sex. And then Milo looks at me, and he's like, Mama, what's sex? And I'm like, dude, seriously? Because we'd been at this for a while, and we'd read multiple books, and I look at him, and I said, it's sex. It's like how babies are made when penis goes in the vagina. And he's like, oh, yes. And he like stop talking, which is how my child is wired. So we start with those kind of basic physiological parts. So think about it like we talk about the facts, like the facts and science of sex, like what goes where, how things work, body parts, changes, safe touch, a little bit about consent, just in terms of people agree to do this, really clear message that sex is not for kids and that every adult knows that. Every adult and older kids knows that sex and touching private parts and sexual touching is not for children. They have to say those words explicitly. And then as they get older, you're going to get more detailed. So by the time they hit middle school, so that's 6th grade-ish, right? They need to know the basics of everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. I mean oral sex, anal sex, STDs, HIV, everything. Different kinds of relationships, gay, straight, gender stuff, like the whole tamale. And when I say the basics, I mean, literally the basics. We're not the joy of sex for our kids. We don't need to explain how to give a blowjob. We need to explain what a blowjob is. So for us as parents, that means that we need to be a little ahead of the game, right? We need to be looking for opportunities for conversation. And so your question was like, what is the goal of all this? The goal is that when your kiddo walks into middle school, and they're hanging out with a bunch of kids that they've never hung out with before. They're hanging out with kids who have a ton of information, and most of it is from peers and porn. And they say to your child, and this is a true story, I had a mom tell me that her daughter in middle school was hanging out with a couple of socially powerful girls, and she wanted to be their friend. And they said to her, if you give that guy a blowjob, then you can be our friend. This girl did not know what a blowjob was. So she said, sure, I can blow. Who can't blow? Right? And so fortunately, it came out to her mom what was going on. And so you want your daughter and your son, A, to say no thank you to offers of blowjobs from random girls, and your daughter to know what that is. So when those socially powerful girls pull that kind of crap, that she's able to say, yeah, not so much, thanks, and move along. So that's the goal, is educated, informed kids so they can make safer decisions, right? There is no silver bullet. There is no guarantee. Kids are going to do stupid stuff, part of growing up. But if they have had you talking to them from an early age openly, and they're really well informed, and especially talking about your values, then they're going to be better set up to ride the wave of, that whole like scene change when they get into, especially like 8th through, 12th grade, when sex is really on the table, sadly, really. And a bummer. Yeah. Seriously, I'm not kidding about like late 20s. It just feels right.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything, because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
If you like this show, there's a decent chance you'll also enjoy the Shameless Mom Academy. Hi, I'm Sarah Dean, the founder and host of the Shameless Mom Academy. The Shameless Mom Academy is a podcast for moms that centers moms more than it centers your kids. I'm not going to teach you how to make baby food or how to make your 3-year-old or 13-year-old stop having tantrums. Instead, I'm going to bring you back to yourself. For the last 20 years, I've been helping moms through growth and transformation. Inside the Shameless Mom Academy, I help you identify who you are and who you are becoming. Look, motherhood is hard. It brought me to my knees many times and sometimes still does. Returning to who I am and who I am becoming allows me to decide how to show up in all those sticky motherhood moments, but also in all my other relationships and in all the ways I show up in my various communities. So come check out the Shameless Mom Academy wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm willing to bet you'll leave feeling a little inspired and maybe even completely fired up. And you'll probably laugh a few times because I promise we never take ourselves too seriously over here. With 700 episodes to choose from, you're likely going to find something that sparks and speaks to you inside the Shameless Mom Academy.
I mean, as you say that now, having a 12-year-old, it does seem young to me, 8th grade. But when I reflect on my years, many, many years ago at this point in the late 1980s when I was in high school, it certainly was something everyone was talking about by 6th, 7th grade. So I don't think that has changed, but our perspective has changed because we're in a different place. Yeah.
Yes. And the thing we all have to embrace is the fact that our kids are exposed to pornography. Mm-hmm. They will be exposed to pornography. So y'all can just stop thinking not my kid, because your child will see porn. They're going to see it at home because you haven't put parental controls and monitoring software on your kids' devices. They're going to see it on the school bus because some kid shows another kid porn on their smartphone. They're going to see it at somebody else's house. They're going to see it, and it's unavoidable. And so you also, and we can probably just let's have another conversation about this.
Yeah, that's a whole episode, I think.
And so, so we really, just the takeaway, please, if you do nothing else, just listen to me when I tell you this. You do not want to be the parent that gets the phone call from the school or from another parent. Your kid showed my kid porn. You don't want to be that parent. Mm-hmm. So you really need to get monitoring software, lock it down, block search terms, and be proactive about the porn education, because that's education they're getting. They're getting porn education, not sex education. And it's way more kids than you would ever think. So it's really a problem. And it makes me cray. So I'll stop talking about it.
Yeah, I think we should come back to this for another episode, but it's certainly something I've been reading a lot about, and it is unavoidable, as you say. And that's the kind of thing I do want to stick my head in the sand.
Yes.
I'll deal with that later.
We all do, but it's not like looking at a Playboy. It's like people actually having really graphic, people don't really do that in real life sex. So let's all take a breath, shall we? I think we should take a breath.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
With these kids, so I'm just thinking when Asher went to camp, before he went to summer sleepaway camp for the first time, which was 2 summers ago, we knew he was going to be with older boys, and we made a point of having some conversations with him to educate him more about things that he might hear, because we want him to hear it from us as opposed to either not knowing what people are talking about or letting older boys educate him. But,
sure.
My child happens to be a child who is really not into having these conversations. And I know that that's a lot. I know there are kids who are really interested in learning more and talking, hyper-focusing on it. And then there are kids who really do not. They're very reluctant anytime. So
that's my child. Yeah.
How do you, for parents who are listening to this who have kids who really shut down? What's the approach?
So a couple things. Kids need books, and they need books about sex. They need books about puberty. So that's the first thing, is you need to lay in a supply of books. So those super private kids, they need to know. And so if they have a private place to go, like looking at a book, and a safe place, like looking at a book, then that helps. Okay. So that's one of the things. But sometimes those kids will refuse to read the books. So I am not beneath bribing. So I actually paid Milo to read one of my favorite books. It's perfectly normal. And we had little like check-in quizzes, and I would, I read the book, of course, myself, and have read it a couple times. And I'm like, so what'd you think about this section? And tell me what you learned about here. And so we do these little pop quiz things just for me to see. And at the end of the day, there is no kid that will actually end up fully resisting learning about sexuality, because when they know that it's a thing and they're hearing about it and their peers are talking about it and they feel stupid, they're going to go find the information. You don't want them looking online.
Right.
So making sure you have books. So that's one of the things I've done. The other thing is that Carrie and I, my husband and I, talk really openly about all kinds of things in front of him. So sometimes it's a rudimentary conversation like, hey, I was just thinking about, I just read about this woman who used in vitro fertilization to get pregnant. Isn't it so interesting? Like, she couldn't get pregnant from having penis and vagina sex. And so sometimes I would even say things like, when the sperm goes and gets the egg and that whole thing. And this is all for Milo's benefit, right? He doesn't know. And then I'll say, and so it's so cool that the doctor can blah, 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 blah. And so I'd throw in the details. So we do that. We talk about stuff in the paper, like talking about abortion. So we'll talk about what abortion is, what our values are about abortion. So he learns about abortion that way. He learns about, hey, usually it's section abortion, but now lots of women take a combination of pills. It's just a different way of, ending the pregnancy. And then, we'll talk about our values about it. And so we have these conversations in front of him. So that's another sneaky way. Mm-hmm. Also, this is a good rule for everybody, just having quick conversations in the car. That also works. And then my last tactic, which has been probably my best tactic. So there's lots of trying to have these sort of casual conversations, and you've got to remember they really can't close their ears. So, and you have to keep them short, especially with a kiddo who's not into it, but most kiddos aren't all that into it. So you got to keep the conversation short. So the other thing I do with Milo is I will say, like, we were in the car one time and we're listening to the radio, and it was NPR, and they were talking about female circumcision. And one of his best friends was in the car with us. And I was pretty damn certain that Milo did not know what female circumcision was. And so I'm like, all right, note to self. So drop off his friend. We're in the car. And I said, hey, I got to talk to you about a sex thing. We can do it now or we can do it later. And he said, later.
Yeah.
Like he always does, right? But what I do when I do that is I'm preparing him. So he knows it's coming. Mm-hmm. So he's slightly more receptive. And so within a day or two, I always find a time to say, hey, okay, now it's later. Sometimes it's on our walk to school in the morning. In this circumstance, we'd gone for a bike ride and we're side to side on the bikes. And I'm like, hey, remember I told you I talked to you about a sex thing? And then I said, we were listening to the thing. I don't know if you heard this, but it was on NPR and they were talking about female circumcision. And so I explained to him what female circumcision is. And told him, like basically the conversation is, what is it? And then what do you believe about it? So it's facts plus values. So I explained my values about it. We motored down the road. He asked me a couple of questions, like basically like, why the hell would they do that? Mm-hmm. And then we head on home, 3 minutes. And so that prepping him, like all that an hour later stuff, he got used to having these conversations, saw that no one died or threw up, right? Both sides. I'm not throwing up. He's not throwing up. No one dies. And so now that he's 16, we have more conversations. He's more patient with me when I'm like, dude, I got to tell you this. He always says, I know. And I'm like, I don't care if you know. I don't know that you know unless I tell you. So listen to me. Shut up and listen to me. And so I think that really one of the takeaways from this is that we need to practice. Parents need to practice initiating conversations that are uncomfortable. So start with small potatoes. Start with small stake stuff. Start with stuff that's not related to sex. Like have a conscious conversation about ironing boards. I'm looking around where I'm standing. Have a conscious conversation about, I don't know what, but have like a specific in your head. Okay, I'm going to explain this thing to my kid and my value about it. Mm-hmm. So when you start practicing that way yourself, then when you say, hey, dude, do you know what oral sex is? And they'll say yes. And you're you're like, crap, right? Or they'll say no, right? And then you talk about it. And even if they say yes, you still have to explain what it is.
Mm-hmm. Do you ask them what they know about it first? Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you heard about it? And with boys, don't look at them in the eye. Don't look them in the eye.
Okay.
Ooh, don't look them. Girls sometimes do. So like side to side while you're doing something else. What is it? Do you know what it is? Yeah, it's when they might say, gross, I'm not telling you. And you say, oh, so I'll tell you, right? Don't let their discomfort shut you up.
Right.
It's fine for your kids to be uncomfortable. Most of life is uncomfortable.
Yes.
And if they can't be comfortable with you, you're their safest person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, come on, you're setting them up for trouble. So everybody gets to practice being uncomfortable. And you say, I'm uncomfortable. My parents never talked to me about this stuff, but I'll be damned if you're going to grow up clueless like I did.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to write that quote down and use it. I love that.
Yeah. Come to it. Say, I'm uncomfortable. I'm sorry I'm uncomfortable. This is not so much fun for me either. But you know what? You need to know.
Right.
You need to know.
When we're traveling and doing road trips, often I have the podcasts on, and we listened to an episode of This American Life during one of our road trips last spring. And we were into an episode before we realized that it was also about female circumcision. And we kind of kept checking in, like, is this okay? Are you okay with this? And he was like, yeah, yes. I'm not sure, But by the time it was over, he was not happy. He's like, I don't think I was ready to know all of that. So we had to have a moment. It's a tricky balance sometimes, especially, and I want to talk about the vulnerabilities of differently wired kids. Some of these kids are also really hypersensitive or feel things, their empathy, sure. It goes on overdrive. And I may have pushed in my desire to be open and honest and, informing him, maybe push that too far. I'm not sure.
Sure. So part of that is when we rely on media to educate our kids, that's when we misstep, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of to yourself, like if you had to do over again, you would have introduced the topic, right? And talked about it in a 3-minute conversation. And then later,
right.
he would have been like, right. So like we prepare, right? We prepare for that. So, and you know what? He's not dead.
Right. He survived it.
He survived. It was uncomfortable. You made a mistake. Everybody learned something. Your child now knows that female circumcision is horrible, yes. Right?
Yeah.
So, right, there we go.
Yeah.
So, yay.
Cross that off the list.
Feminist boy on his way.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's talk about differently wired kids. So one of the things about differently wired kids in any kind of way, is that they are more vulnerable because of their different wiring. So with children who are more vulnerable, they need as much, if not more, sexual health education than other kiddos. They need to be super empowered with information so that they to the best of their ability, right? Because differently wired means all kinds of different things. I know in your case, your kiddo is autistic, so that's different, right? But your child's more vulnerable because it's easier to manipulate them. So when they have a really clear message about the privacy of their bodies, who's allowed to touch them, who's not, they're encouraged to say no to uncomfortable touch, that you do the practice of asking permission first before you kiss or hug or touch your child, and making sure everybody else does that. It's about learning consent. So when they understand, like I said, sex and sexual touching is not for kids. Every adult knows this. Every older kid knows that. Talking about job roles, talking about, your coach's job is to coach you. It's not to give you a ride home. It's not to give you a massage. It's not to give you treats. It's not to give you anything. It's to coach your soccer team. That's the coach's job. So being very explicit about that is really important. And letting them know, that you don't keep secrets in your family. The secrets are one of the things that really cause a lot of problems. So if somebody asks them to keep a secret, the rule is that you always tell.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's no secret keeping. And there's a couple of really good resources for this kind of safety talk. Savvy Parents, Safe Kids is a really good resource. They have some on stuff. Yeah, Kim Estes, my colleague and friend. So Savvy Parents, Safe Kids is a really good resource. They have this thing called the Super 10 Rules for Safety that you can just download it, print it, toss it in the back seat of the car, have your kids read it and talk about what each rule means. And the other thing too, just on this topic, is that strangers are not a threat to your children. The person who's going to molest or harass your child is someone you know or someone they know.
Right.
Strangers, it doesn't happen. It's just super rare.
Yeah.
So, give up the stupid stranger danger thing. It really did kids and adults a disservice. So and helping them practice being out and about in the world, and and really just, again, talking openly about sexuality, because when kids know that you're open to talking about this, that's safer for them. When they see that you're willing to be uncomfortable and you don't freak out when you're talking about this or they ask a question, that's also makes things safer for them. And some kids are hypersensitive. They don't want to hear this. It's very upsetting to them, just any of it. So with those kids, you need to move really slowly. So your child's temperament, when your child's in a good space and in a not so good space. Not so good space, not time to try and ram a sex talk down their throats, right?
Yeah,
right. It's not the time, right? You look for these times of openness and connect, and when they're feeling more connected and calm, and then you have the conversation with them. But don't let your fear of the conversation get in the way of your having the conversation. Sometimes kids get this information, they can't shut up about it, right? So if that's the case, then, maybe you wait longer before you talk to your kid about the nuts and bolts of, making babies and all that stuff, but don't wait to talk to them about physical touch and safety. Mm-hmm. That's nothing. Don't wait for that ever. They need to know the names for their private body parts. I mean, that's the sex talk you have with your baby. Remember at the top I said, I could freak you out and tell you to have a sex talk with your baby. That's the sex talk with your baby.
Right. So using the literal names for things as opposed to nicknames or...
Yep. You say penis, not tallywhacker. You say testicles, scrotum, anus, vulva, vagina, clitoris, urethra, ovaries, all the parts.
Yep, right.
All the parts you can see. And, and then remind people, remind your kids, especially if you have a kid who's a blurter or who's going to share the good news, that, people feel it's weird, and just say it's weird, but people feel really uncomfortable around this when they hear this stuff. We're not, but other people are. Don't want people to be uncomfortable. So the rule is, we talk about this at home with us and me, your father, your other mother, or whatever, safe adults, and just lay down the ground rules about it. And then you just do what you get. I mean, just cross your fingers, right? I mean, I'd rather have a kid who's the town crier and is filling everybody in than a kid who's clueless.
Well, and also, you talked about looking for these openings to have these conversations. That really speaks to why it's so important that we as parents get clear on what our message is. We don't put that off doing the personal work ourselves and understanding our values, understanding how we want to approach these conversations, because when those openings happen, we want to be able to take advantage of them and not lose that window.
And I know as they get older, the windows get closing.
Right. I'm sure.
Yeah, it gets harder and better and better too. I mean, one of my personal rules is that for the time kids are 13, no filters. Mm-hmm. Just tell them everything. Mm-hmm. And again, your child's temperament, right? Your child's developmental level, your child. So sometimes that might be too much for a 13-year-old, your particular 13-year-old. But generally speaking, I think it's safer to err on the side of over-information than under-information. And our impulse is to give them not enough information. So
because we want to protect them, or we want to shield, keep them innocent, or whatever it is. Right. Yeah.
It's just false thinking. That's not true.
It's not helpful. Right.
Not helpful. Not true.
So what about kids who, a lot of differently wired kids struggle to read social cues. And I imagine that as they start exploring dating and relationships, that is a factor in how those situations unfold. How can we help our kids figure out how to read those important social cues so they make sure they don't put themselves in an uncomfortable or unsafe position, or making sure that they're not misreading their date's intentions or cues that they're trying? Do you have any advice about that?
Yeah, I actually do. I have some thoughts. And then I also have an excellent resource. There is a website and a lovely woman who runs this website called autismsexeducation.com. And she specifically provides education information for folks with autism, including kids, and their special needs and kind of how to handle those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So there's books. Great. Her name's Davida Hartman. She might be a really great person to have on the show just to kind of follow up, because I'm sort of the generalist, right? She's really lovely. She has written a book called Sexuality and Relationship Education for Children and Adolescents with Autism Spectrum Disorders. And so one of the things for those kids would be to have lots of conversations about checking in, mm-hmm. right? Like, check first. Is this okay? And you can practice that. You can role play it too, right? And it just in terms of, you're sitting next to me. I'm noticing, that your thigh is right next to mine. Would it be okay if I put my hand, if we held hands? Can I put my hand on your leg? Is that okay? And so like talking about it. And I'm not an expert in this arena at all. I'm a very pragmatic human. So some of this is me sort of running on gut. So lots of conversation about the most important part of sex is the talking, right? It's communication. So if you're already working on communication anyway, like when you add in the dating and relationship communication, it's lots of questions like, is this okay? And then they're waiting for a yes, right?
Right. Yep. That's great.
So, I think you just have to my guess is you need to think about it in terms of broader social skills. Like, how do we, what we do intuitively, I am not differently wired. So what I do intuitively when I'm interacting with someone, how do you teach that to someone, right? So it's just on a broader scale. Like if someone's leaning in, like I would even pick apart movies, right? Like, let's watch this. Like, watch this. Like, see how their bodies are close together. Do you see how her head's tilted? She's leaning into him. She's telling him with her body that she's interested in kissing him. Do you see how he's leaning back? Right.
So like,
right. Yeah. See how he's recoiling from her? That's the same, right? That he's saying no with his body. Right. So, I'm sure this is stuff you're probably, lots of y'all folks are working on with your kiddos in terms of just general social skills. It's general, that kind of how to read somebody's cues. So Davita's got lots of information and support. So I'm just going to point you over to her. And, she's got books on her site and stuff like that. And again, for me, we've got to come back to that. This is health and safety. You want your child to be healthy and safe. Yeah. And you certainly don't want your child to be a predator, right? Right. So, and nobody wants their child to be a predator. And, I think that's one of the other things we really need to be thinking about, especially with our boys, is how do we talk to them about how do you not be that guy?
Right.
Yep. I'm just reading the book Missoula by John Krakauer. And it's about the University of Montana campus, and they had a run of acquaintance rapes. And it pieces apart like how it happens, why it happens, and how these young men get away with this all the time. And it's quite eye-opening and uncomfortable. And poor Milo, speaking of like having conversations, right? Like I am reading this book and I am like, oh my God. And I'll read stuff out loud to Carrie with Milo sitting right there. Right. Or, while we're walking, I'm like, oh my God, these guys, this is what happens. And I explain to Milo what they're doing and what their thought process is. And then, and then I make a joke because that's how I am.
Yeah.
So like the rule in our family is no raping. Right. And so, but he doesn't, unless he's hearing it, sort of from me or Carrie, more importantly, Carrie, right? He's going to be trying to make it up on his own. So he needs to know the cues, right? Like he needs to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a huge responsibility to be raising a man, and I take that responsibility very seriously. And we do talk a lot about these. Unfortunately, the last year and the election cycle in the U.S. has given us a lot of opportunity to talk about all of these issues. But I do love the thanks for referring that book. I love John Krakauer, and I'll check that out. But I think that is a great way to introduce this, just kind of from a young age, talking about these issues and consent. And it's a big responsibility to raise a respectful man.
Right. And these boys that did these rapes, they on the surface, everybody loved them. They were like, he's such a great guy. He's such a great guy. He's such a great guy. Yeah. And he had sex with his good friend while she was asleep. Right? Wow. What happens? So he pieces that apart. So hold on to your hat while you're reading that. And then the other book I highly recommend, which is also somewhat traumatizing, is Girls and Sex by Peggy Orenstein. Also quite eye-opening and very uncomfortable. And I was reading it on an airplane, which I don't know if that was the best thing because I'm like, oh my God.
Oh no.
I knew the stuff was going on. I understand how it all works, but just somehow reading it and reading these young women's stories and what they're thinking and how they're behaving, and was just like, it was almost too much for me. So,
wow. If it's too much for you, that's saying something.
Yeah. It was hard, but we need to know. And we also, as parents, need to just stop thinking, not my kid.
Yep.
Because the reality is maybe your kid. And for sure, your kid's going to have sex someday. I mean, that's just a given. But yeah, anyway, so not to end all in gloom and doom.
No, I think this is so important. And it just reiterates why it's so critical that we foster healthy conversations with our kids around sex, that there's really nothing off the table, and that we do it in a way that helps them respect themselves and respect other people. And I have so many great notes to share on the show notes, all the great books. And I would actually like if you could just take a minute or two to tell us about your books that you have available as well, so listeners can know how to interact with those.
Yeah, totally. So I have 2 books out. The first is called Birds and Bees and Your Kids, and it's a guide to help you share your beliefs about sexuality with your children. So it's available on Kindle, and I'm going to actually have it available in real form here in probably 2 weeks. So
great.
If you want to hold off, I read crap on Kindle. I like to read real books most of the time. So I wrote that to help parents get the values piece in place for themselves. And I talk about how to talk and when to talk and give tips for that kind of the conversation. But my belief is that half the battle is knowing your values. And y'all have heard my values while I've been talking, right? Y'all know I'm a liberal nut job. And I don't believe that my job isn't to change your way of thinking about your value system. My job is to set you up to be really clear about your sexual value system. So that's my first book. And then my second book is for teenagers. It's called Dating Smarts: What Every Teen Needs to Know to Date, Relate, or Wait. And I take kids through all the different aspects, like how to go on a date. Like I parse out like a first date. I help kids figure out what their sexual values are, so that when they're in that dating moment, they understand like, oh, this is not something I'm down with. This isn't within my value system. I talk about healthy relationships. I talk about sex too, like, STIs and all that stuff too. So lots of parents buy the Dating Smarts books when their kids are in like late elementary, middle school, because it actually gives them talking points so they can talk about like, oh, hey, did you know that this is not did you know I was thinking about this thing about like healthy relationships, and just gives them other just fodder, right, to make the conversations easier.
Right.
So those are my 2 books. And then my website, birdsandbeesandkids.com, is just about to be, I don't know if you've ever remodeled a website.
Yes, unfortunately, many times.
It takes forever. So we're in the middle of the forever. So I'm going to have a new site up soon, hopefully. But in the meantime, you can go slog around on my old site. There's tons of resources there. I do have a newsletter that I send out a couple times a month with tips and tricks for staying on track of talking to your kids. So you can sign up for that through my website. And then I teach webinars about once a month on different more in-depth topics. And I'm going to be doing those for free in the new year. So I have one, I haven't gotten it scheduled yet, coming up on genders and sexualities, so we can understand what's going on, because it's confusing. So that'll come up sometime towards the end of the month. And you can watch them anytime. You can watch them live, or you can watch the recording.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And then I travel and do talks for parents all over the country. And I also work with professionals who work with children. I teach sexual abuse prevention through the lens of healthy childhood sexuality. So lots of ways to play.
Yeah, that's great. And, I'm sure as listeners have been listening to this episode, you are a wealth of information, and it's great that you're accessible to people who live around the world. I'm excited about your webinars. I will definitely check those out. We'll be getting the books for sure, and we will have to have you back on the show, because this was a long episode, and thanks for hanging in, listeners, but I was riveted, and I hope you were too. But we'll have to have you back on the show to have a part 2 of this. There's so much to discuss here.
Yes, I'd be totally happy to. I'm happy to support your community and your work as well.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for being on the show. I always say I have the best job in the world because I get to interview people like you. And of course, I benefit greatly from this selfishly. But I knew this was going to be a fascinating conversation, and my expectations were totally met. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here today.
My total pleasure.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. For the show notes for this episode, including links to Amy's website, her books, and the rest of the resources we discussed on today's show, visit the show notes page at tiltparenting.com/session44. If you like what you heard on today's episode and you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to our podcast on iTunes, or even better, leave a review. This really helps our podcast get more visibility. And lastly, if you're not already signed up for our newsletter, I'd love for you to join our Tilt Parenting online community. I send out short weekly updates with links to new content on the Tilt website, articles, and resources just for you. Thanks again for listening. For more information on Tilt Parenting, visit www.tiltparenting.com.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.